Hello everyone, welcome ladies and gentlemen to our next panel in our conference Quo Vadis, Belarus, yet another panel in English. My name is Daniel, and together with my colleague here, Martyna, we shall moderate and oversee this panel. As per usual, our speakers will have about 20 minutes each for presenting and showing us what they prepared. And after that, we'll proceed to the debate and answer any questions sent by our dear viewers. We encourage you to comment and ask questions, because what is science without a good debate? And I'm giving the floor to my colleague Martyna, who will present our speakers.
Hello, I'm Martyna, and we'd like to start this panel with expert Solomiya Kharchuk from University of Wrocław with her presentation on The Dragon, Money and Europe, Last Dictator, China's approach to protests in Belarus in the light of Neo-Marxism. And we'd like to give the floor to her to present that presentation.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And can you see something?
We saw for a second, but it disappeared, so.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. Like it worked a moment ago.
Yes, it showed up, but. Okay, now we see.
Hopefully it will work again. That's really... Okay, so...
Okay, it not disappeared again, so I don't know what's happening.
I literally have the black screen for the second time.
Okay, but...
I will try to do it in a different way. So...
Yeah.
Yeah, that was... You can see something.
Yeah, we can see now, so I guess we have to settle for this.
Okay, so today I'd love to present the neo-Marxist account of China's approach to protests in Belarus. And we need to go back to August 2020, when the protests broke out in Belarus, and the response of the government of Belarus was not peaceful. And the response of China was ambiguous, because while China declared that it had always respected the development path chosen by the people of Belarus, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, he congratulated Lukashenko quite promptly. And the question is why? What is behind the scenes of China's response to these protests? And the answer that I will provide today is based on neo-Marxist theory of international relations. And this is the world systems theory, which I'm going to present at the beginning of my speech. After that, I will present the relations between China and Belarus, especially the economic ties between these two countries. And I will also explain why Belarus is significant for China. And finally, I will present Beijing's response to this political crisis in terms of overaccumulation, because today I will argue that economic forces drive the international politics, and they also determine the behavior of China. First of all, this is Emmanuel Wallerstein, and he created the world systems theory. He actually died 2 years ago. And according to him, the modern world system is and has actually always been the capitalist world economy. And why is it economy? It's quite simple, because the division of labor exists within the system. Also, the internal exchange of goods, labor, and capital occurs like constantly. And the more important question is what makes this system the capitalist world system. And according to Emmanuel Wallerstein, we are in the capitalist system only when this system gives priority to the endless accumulation of capital. And that means that companies and people are constantly accumulating capital in order to accumulate even more capital in the future. And this is the most important feature of the system we function in. Also, what holds the system together is the efficiency, the effectiveness of the division of labor. Because of that, we can distinguish between the core-like products and the peripheral products. And this distinction is based on the degree of profitability. Also, when the core periphery exchange occurs, it results in what has been called the unequal exchange. So there is this constant flow of surplus value from the producers of peripheral products to the producers of core-like products. To make it simple, from this poor man to this wealthy man. And what is important for this, when it comes to this topic, is that we might distinguish between peripheral states and core states. So when the peripheral production processes dominate in some state, this is the peripheral state. When core-like processes dominate, this is the core state. If neither dominate, this is the semi-peripheral state. But we have to bear in mind that this distinction stems from the distinction between the production processes. Another important feature of the capitalist world economy is that this economy fluctuates between the A phases of expansion and the B phases of contraction. The next important question is how the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative might be perceived in the light of this theory. To answer this question, we need to go back to 1990s. That is when Chinese leadership, and that is when China, under the Deng Xiaoping leadership, initiated the reforms, which led to the development of China, to the development of Chinese economy, to the modernization of the Chinese economy, and to the expansion of the Chinese economy. This also pushed China, so China managed to catch up with capitalist core states. But starting from 2000s, Chinese economy, according to the Chinese expert, Chang, Chinese economy began to show various symptoms of overaccumulation, and it began in 2000s. Because of that, Chinese leadership and Chinese companies were pushed to geographically expand the capital accumulation. This is something that is called the spatial fix. So capitalists solve the internal problems by geographically expanding the capital accumulation. And that is what pushed China to announce the going out strategy in 2000s. In 2013, Chinese leader Xi Jinping took the going out strategy to the absolutely new level when he announced the Belt and Road Initiative. This initiative includes two components: the Silk Road Economic Belt, the blue one, which is actually more important when it comes to my speech, and the second component is the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. And generally, experts argue that Belarus is a significant component of the China's Belt and Road. The first reason is the geographical position of Belarus. So Belarus lies between Europe and Asia. It is kind of a bridge between Europe and Asia, and strategic transport routes pass through this country. And the second reason is the Great Stone Industrial Park, which is one of the most notable examples of China's investment in Belarus. This park attracts foreign companies, especially Chinese companies. Also, Belarusian leader, President Alexander Lukashenko, is a vocal supporter of the strategic economic partnership between Minsk and Beijing. And that stems from the fact that he wants to reduce his country's dependence on Russia. And this desire dates back to 1990s. In 1995, Alexander Lukashenko traveled to Beijing for the first time. And since that moment, he has been declaring the need to develop this very special relationship between China and Belarus. However, experts argue that this relationship is not quite profitable for Belarus because, first of all, in recent years, the trade deficit has been increasing. That means that Belarus is constantly buying more from China than it sells to China. Also, the second reason is connected with the infamous Chinese credits. These are criticized because these credits are granted to Belarusian companies, but under the terms of these agreements, Belarusian companies have to buy Chinese equipment. And this led to the development of Chinese economy, not the Belarusian economy. Everything that I've said before is the background of China's response to protests in Belarus. So when in August 2020, these protests broke out, China declared, as I mentioned before, that Beijing had always respected the development path chosen by the people of Belarus. But also, Chinese Foreign Ministry declared that it would oppose any external forces who would create further divisions. Also, Chinese ministry declared that it didn't want Belarus to descend into chaos. And after that, Alexander Lukashenko was congratulated by Xi Jinping. And generally, experts argue that these protests are very inconvenient for China. These are a problem for China in the eyes of Beijing, because China perceives Belarus as a potential entry point to the European markets. And it doesn't matter what the outcome of these protests is going to be. It will be very inconvenient for China anyway. So if the opposition had won, which is highly unlikely in the near future, this new democratic government might reconsider this strategic partnership with China. And if Lukashenko did use the security forces to stay in power, so he will most likely stay in office in the near future. And that is still not very good for China, because the relations between Belarus and the European Union has deteriorated. These became much worse in recent months. And because of that, it will be much harder for China to use Belarus as the potential entry point to the European markets. And finally, the conclusion is quite short. China has been supporting Alexander Lukashenko, not for the sake of Alexander Lukashenko, not for the sake of the strategic partnership, and not for the sake of this friendship between China and Belarus, but because it is consistent with China's economic interests. China needs Belarus to solve its internal crisis, the internal crisis which is occurring within the Chinese economy. And Belarus is part of this solution. Thank you.
We thank Solomiya Kharchuk for her really interesting presentation, and we'd like to encourage the viewers to comment and ask the question about this presentation. And now we'd like to give the floor to Andrew Carroll from Young Professionals in Foreign Policy and US Air Force, which has the presentation on NATO-Belarus relations, potential for improving regional strategic stability. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and my thanks to the event organizers for putting this on. Just before jumping into the presentation, I want to be absolutely clear that everything I say is my own opinion. It does not represent that of the United States Air Force, the United States Department of Defense, or the United States government, as well as my other affiliation, YPFP, or Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. And with that disclaimer out of the way, I will jump into the presentation. So hopefully everyone can see that. So to kick this off, just to start, I wanted to open up with a discussion of what exactly we mean when we say strategic stability. That can be a bit of an interesting topic, especially when we talk about European security and all the various conflicts and challenges that we face in this environment nowadays. So really, when we talk about strategic stability, the origins of this term we can find in the 1990s largely, but also the late 80s, the end of the Cold War. This term was developed between the United States and the new Russian Federation to describe an environment of absence of incentives for an American or Russian first nuclear strike on another country. And strategic stability was largely measured in terms of vulnerability of strategic force components, meaning could another country take out another country's nuclear missiles on the ground before they were able to launch them, which would provide an advantage and be able to mitigate damage in the event of an all-out war, as was planned for during the Cold War. As we move through the 1990s and into the 21st century, the analysis of strategic stability has changed somewhat in that the development of precision strike conventional weapons, be it long-range cruise missiles, conventional ballistic missiles, also NATO expansion, the expansion of membership into the former Warsaw Pact, more into Central and Eastern Europe, and a renewed focus on nuclear deterrence in recent years amid nuclear modernization currently conducted by both the United States and Russia. There has been a renewed focus on this strategic stability, which has also rose to new prominence with the collapse of arms control regimes like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty or the INF Treaty. So with that framework in mind, we can move to the modern security context. As many of you are probably aware, Belarus occupies a pretty strategic position when it comes to NATO defense planning, especially post 2014 with the deployment and current operation of NATO battle groups in Poland and the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And Belarus occupies a key position along what is called the Suwalki Gap or the Suwalki Corridor, which is the small gap between Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia, and Belarus, the only land bridge between Poland and Lithuania, which would be NATO's only ability to reinforce itself over land in the event of a crisis. Belarus is also a key military ally of Russia, as has been reinforced with the 2020 protests, and we'll continue to discuss. They have shared air defense zones. They're part of this ambiguous union state format, which we'll also further discuss. And Belarus is part of the CSTO, or the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is sometimes considered a Russian-led version of NATO, but really is not as integrated as NATO itself. Russia, though, does consider Kaliningrad a strategic vulnerability, and that highlights the importance of Belarus and this union state concept, while NATO also then considers the Suwalki Corridor a strategic vulnerability because it would make it much harder to reinforce our allies in the Baltic states in the event of a crisis. So these competing strategic concerns drive an increase in strategic instability, which leads to a deterioration of relations. Combine that with a collapse of arms control regimes and an overall climate of mistrust, and you lead to the current situation we are in. But it puts Belarus in a very interesting position, being in that in-between space between NATO and Russia. And as we'll discuss, Belarus's role of playing that mediation role is something that is very unique and could be a point of change for the future. With that in mind, I think it's important to also discuss the role of Belarus in European military history, that Belarus has played a very important role in both NATO and Soviet military planning, but largely for its role in history as a historic invasion route into central Russia and to Moscow itself through an area known as the Smolensk Gates. This was a key point for Napoleon's Grande Armée during its invasion and later retreat from Russia. The Nazi armies used this during Operation Barbarossa to invade the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet army pushed into Belarus through this same corridor in a military operation in 1944 known as Operation Bagration, which destroyed the Nazi Army Group Center, and some military historians have said was more important than the Battle of Stalingrad in defeating the Nazi German armies. So Belarus has long played this very important focal point in European military affairs, and something that continued to allow it to play this role in the Cold War and to today. So with that historical context in mind, we can move into the Cold War itself. That Belarus served then as a key focal point for military exercises, namely the Zapad military exercises, or West, is what that means in Russian through the translation. And it was a key point of supply as well for the Warsaw Pact, given its location right next to many of the former Warsaw Pact states. With that in mind, Belarus received a lot of advanced military equipment that would come in handy, or would come into play later after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But because of that strategic location and the distribution of military equipment into Belarus, including nuclear weapons, Minsk became a key factor in both Soviet and NATO defense planning as a way to counter one another. And in the 1980s, with the shift away from mutually assured destruction and an idea of all-out nuclear war, and a movement towards the doctrine of air-land battle on the NATO side, and a increased belief in limited nuclear war, Belarus became an increasingly important focal point. This was displayed by a novel written by British General Sir John Hackett in the early 1980s, in which he outlined what a potential Third World War could look like. And in the novel, it results in a nuclear strike on both a city in the United Kingdom as well as Minsk in Belarus, showing that in the event of a war in the later stages of the Cold War, Belarus would play a very important role. And despite the fact that many people nowadays don't think of Belarus too much as playing an important role in Cold War planning with the idea of an all-out nuclear war, it did play a very important role for defense planners. And as we'll discuss, it still does today. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Belarus inherited a large quantities of military equipment from the former Soviet military, including nuclear weapons. Belarus didn't really have the technical facilities to maintain those weapons, unlike neighboring Ukraine. So those were quickly dispensed with as a means to gain international recognition. But Belarus was still part of the INF Treaty. It wasn't just the United States and Russia. Ukraine and Belarus were also parties to that treaty as former nuclear states. With that in mind, though, Belarus began to develop its relations with NATO in the early 1990s after achieving independence. They joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council in 1992. This later became the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council in 1997. And Belarus opened its official mission to NATO in Brussels in 1998, after joining the Partnership for Peace program, which it is still officially a part of today, although that relationship has begun to deteriorate somewhat. Although this did allow for limited military-to-military consultation and defense planning through the PFP planning and review process. Relations, again, were furthered with the first round of NATO expansion in 1999, when Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary became the first of the former Warsaw Pact countries to join the Transatlantic Alliance. This, again, prompted Belarus to increase its consultations with NATO, given that many of its neighbors were starting to join. And that continued as more countries in the early 2000s began to join NATO as well. That being said, attempts to improve relations between Belarus and NATO were limited, as they were often blocked by Lithuania, at least pre-2020, to resume deeper dialogue between Belarus and NATO, largely over Lithuanian concerns over the Ostrovets nuclear power plant, which is still an object of concern for Vilnius today. That being said, after the Belarusian election protests in 2010 and the political imprisonment of a number of Belarusian citizens, the United States and European Union imposed sanctions on Belarus. And that led to a real deterioration of relations between NATO members and Belarus. Belarus withdrew its ambassador from Washington. The U.S. later did the same. And as we saw at the time, there really wasn't much of an interest in having a NATO-Belarus relationship with a deeper focus on European integration, as well as the war in Afghanistan. Belarus looked to be an afterthought. And if we look at the 2010 NATO strategic concept, there's really not any sort of mention between having a strategic relationship with Belarus and NATO and the role that that relationship could play. That being said, during this time, Belarus is still deepening its ties with Moscow. As we mentioned before, this union state concept was signed in 1999. It really is rather ambiguous, as I mentioned previously, but does allow for a projected goal of integration of the two countries. On paper, lays out objectives of how to integrate the countries in the future. We can debate on whether or not how feasible that will be or how likely that will be, but on paper it is a factor and does play into military affairs. Security relations were also deepened through the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and there were some limited Russian military deployments in Belarus, mainly like radar stations, nothing long-term and significant, which will come into play later. Also, again, Belarus was the site of military exercises through Zapad, and the Belarusian economy became increasingly reliant on Russia, namely through the oil refinement sector. Without Russian subsidies and Russian discounts on military equipment, the Belarusian economy really would not be able to survive. So that deepening relationship is very important. That being said, in 2014, the invasion of Crimea really is a touchstone in Belarus-Russian relations and Belarus's relations with NATO. Russia's illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea from Ukraine really came as a shock to NATO and Belarus, caught a lot of NATO officials off guard, and the same for Belarus, as officials in Minsk realized that the same could happen to them in Belarus. It also showed the success of the Russian military and their new look reforms on the conventional side after some setbacks and failures in their 2008 invasion of Georgia. NATO, of course, responded to this with the enhanced forward presence battle group deployment in Poland and the Baltic states. And at the same time, cracks began to emerge after this in the Belarus and Russia security relationship. So when we get into the specifics of this Belarus-Russia security relationship and how it impacts strategic stability, Belarus, after 2014, begins to take on this new posture towards Russia, with one of the key factors in this being the rejection of a long-planned Russian permanent airbase in 2015. This was a real blow to the Putin regime and the Kremlin, which had long planned on having this as a means to counter both NATO expansion and an increasing NATO military deployment on its eastern flank. This also, though, came at a cost to Belarus, which saw the limited delivery of promised military equipment, namely air defense units and aircraft, which Belarus had been hoping to get a discount on. As a result of that, Belarus was operating older and older Soviet-era military equipment and receiving older air defense equipment than Russia was giving, for example, to countries like Iran. However, Belarus was taking this advantage of this time to develop closer security relations with Ukraine, with Lukashenko saying that Belarus will not be an invasion route for Ukraine to satisfy and assuage concerns in Kyiv, as well as in Brussels with NATO. And post-2014, the Belarusian Ministry of Defense also rewrote their security strategy to focus on hybrid warfare and specifically on a partisan-style warfare in an homage to the fact that in Belarus today, a lot of emphasis placed on the role of the partisans and their fight against the Nazis during World War II. This comes at the same time that Belarus began to take a more and more important role in international organizations, namely the OSCE, inviting groups from the Munich Security Conference to Minsk, and also, again, hosting the Minsk group on Ukraine. All of this shows a willingness to more engage with the European Union, the United States, and NATO, as it means to be a neutral mediator and not taking a side, really distancing itself from its former very close security relationship to Moscow. This really came to a head, I would say, during the Zapad 2017 military exercises, which had been one of the largest Russian military exercises, Russian-led military exercises, I should say, to date. Initially, Belarus really rebuked Russia during these military exercises when they put limits on Russian military deployments in Belarus to comply with the OSCE Vienna document. Russia violated it in other cases on Russian territory, even though it has agreed to these provisions. And against Russian will, Belarus invited NATO observers from Poland and the Baltic states, as well as Ukraine and Sweden. Putin, as a result of this, canceled a trip to view the exercises in Belarus with Lukashenko. However, there were concerns over additional Russian deployments long-term and the establishment of new railheads to move heavy armor in Russian towns close to the eastern border of Belarus. That being said, though, a lot of NATO concerns during this time were that Russia would use this as a means to establish a long-term military presence in Belarus, and that was rebuffed by the Lukashenko regime, which was important for showing as a signal to NATO that Belarus was willing to have a close relationship. That being said, though, at the same time, the U.S. was beginning to also develop closer ties with Belarus. Former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, A. Wes Mitchell, at the Atlantic Council in 2018, referred to Belarus, along with Ukraine and Georgia, as a bulwark against Russian neo-imperialism. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited Minsk pre-pandemic and as a means to deepen U.S.-Belarus ties. And the U.S. also announced that it would be sending an ambassador back to Minsk, which was a key sign that there was the beginnings of a new relationship. That being said, at the same time, Belarus was deepening security relations with China, developing weapon systems, and all of that was a bit of a rebuke to Russia, but also something that was of more concern to NATO. Now, moving to 2020, Lithuania has increasingly taken a leading role among NATO member states as promoting solidarity with the Belarusian people amid the ongoing protests. And Lukashenko has increasingly turned, it seems, against a closer ties with NATO that had been occurring from 2014 to 2020, having accused NATO of actually helping to facilitate the protests, which NATO leaders have rebuked. At the same time, Belarus, as our last presentation so brilliantly laid out, there has been an increasing Belarus-China relationship, and that is something that is of concern for deepening NATO-Belarus ties, as we saw recently with the NATO 2030 report that Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently released. NATO is really looking to have a increased focus on China. So that could be something that is a limiting factor as the transatlantic alliance looks more towards countering Chinese influence in Europe. That hurts the ability for the two to come together and develop a new relationship. That being said, within the Belarusian Ministry of Defense, which is currently led by Major General Viktor Krenin, there is, I would say, a bit of a reluctance so far to intervene in the protests. Obviously, the security services have been used to brutalize the protesters, but it still remains to be seen if they're going to play a role. And that, I think, could be a role in driving a NATO-Belarus relationship, restarting those military-to-military ties to ensure that the security services do not intervene to abuse the rights and lives of the people still protesting for their rights on the streets in Belarus. That could be a means to deal with the current situation and deal with the fact that Lukashenko still remains in power and still retains control over the Ministry of Defense and the other security services in the country. That being said, Belarus's past willingness to reach out to the OSCE and other organizations shows there is a willingness to engage, and I think NATO should take advantage of that, beginning on the military level, as a means to establish a dialogue, and with the collapse of arms control regimes, possibly having Belarus act as a neutral mediator, after it proves that it will not use its security services to abuse the rights of protesters. That could be a means to drive a new relationship for strategic stability in Central and Eastern Europe, especially between NATO and Russia. That being said, I'll wrap up here and turn back over to the organizers. Look forward to any questions you have, and thank you very much for your time.
We thank Mr. Andrew Carroll for his really thorough presentation on the topic, and we would like to once again remind the viewers of the opportunity to ask the questions in the comments. And now we'd like to move on to the presentation by Ms. Nina Basok from College of Europe in Natolin on the topic Belarus. Is it another Ukraine? The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the organizers for having me and for everybody for participating and having really interesting discussions in here. Unfortunately, I don't have a presentation, so you're going to be looking up to my face for quite some time. And as I'm seeing that we are kind of running out of time a little bit, I'm going to try to be brief in my topic. So what I'd like to start with is with the question of the European Union, its role in the Eastern neighborhood. So European Union supports many countries as a part of its European neighborhood policy. And this year, Eastern Partnership countries experience a new wave of demonstrations, fight for human rights and its freedoms, making the EU think that a new color revolution or another armed conflict are inevitable. So in previous years, Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine contributed to the range of frozen conflicts that engaged the EU in some point of their escalation. And in 2020, Nagorno-Karabakh and Belarus became the next milestone in the improvement of EU's conflict resolution skills. All of these countries are far from having perfect relations with the European Union. And in my presentation, I'd like to refer to Lukashenko's attempt to save his presidential status by threatening people with the consequences of uprisings resembling those in Ukraine. So is Belarus another Ukraine now? Well, during Lukashenko's public and media appearances, he was constantly repeating that the sovereignty of Belarusian state can be violated. However, he does not want to specify who can be in charge of such processes. So why Belarus in 2020 cannot be considered as Ukraine in 2013 and 2014? So where's this mistake come from? So the first and the foremost visible difference is that uprising against Lukashenko has an accumulative character, whereas in Ukraine it was a blast that nobody could predict. In the beginning, it was not focused on the president himself, but rather on the decision he made by turning down EU and its association agreement proposal. Belarus had protests directed against Lukashenko's regime, not the absence of EU integration processes in the country. So Belarusian opposition leaders inquire EU's help in regulating the situation in Belarus. However, they do forget that de facto EU has no power to intervene in the internal processes of the country. At most, what they can do is to organize negotiations and mediate them between the opposition and so-called Belarusian authorities, organize some support packages for the civil society, urge international organizations to note the crimes committed by the government, but no overall effect would be invisible. So it was not the Ukrainian case. Even if Ukraine ended up having EU's mediation intervention, so to say, Ukraine president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, took away the possibility for a brighter future in the EU from the population. So where Ukrainian students played a crucial role of starting the European movement for showing EU their European aspirations, so to speak. that was sort of the push for European Union to act respectively. Ukraine was trying to escape from Russian influence since its independence. That was exactly one of the aspects during Orange Revolution in 2004. When Yanukovych resigned from signing association agreement with EU over the customs union with Russia in charge, it was a clear statement that Ukraine would go back to past, where Russia would control Ukraine with its money, credit loans, and so on. What is the situation now? What was before and now is in Belarus. So Belarusian case is not directed against the past and present Russian hegemony in the region and in the country overall, but concentrated on Lukashenko's individual itself. I should mention that there were protests in Belarus where when Lukashenko and Putin were working on the coordination of the roadmaps connecting Belarus with Russia, or the proposal of changing Belarusian ruble currency into united Russian ruble to avoid bigger devaluation of Belarusian currency in 2018-2019. And there was a little quantity of people involved in those protests. And those protesters were also imprisoned the same way as it is done now. By the amount of prison people, well, it cannot be compared to those ones that we have today. What I would like to say is that protests and sort of people's uprising before the election, during the elections, and after it were not directly connected to the Russians' influence on the Belarusian politics either. So it is obvious that Russia plays a crucial role in the region, despite EU's attempts to get its neighbors closer by managing its partnership and launching some help packages for each state. And Russia's influence is inevitable due to the geopolitical location of Belarus and Ukraine. Their historical past, even if it was more negative than positive, and etc. So if we compare to EU's member states, not all of the countries are actually interested in Ukraine and Belarus. So again, first support signals were sent from Lithuania and Poland in both cases. Lithuanian president in 2013-14, Dalia Grybauskaitė, supported Ukraine and lobbied for its interests in the European Union. Same as Poland was the first to suggest negotiations in Ukraine to stop the violence against the people on Maidan. In Belarusian case, Poland and Lithuania got the same position and were the first to urge European Union into actions to help Belarusians. Here we are getting back to the point where we touch upon Russian influence and relations of these two states with the European Union and NATO partners, as it was said before in the presentation done by Andrew, if I may, you call so. Belarus didn't have that good relations with NATO or with EU. So why Ukraine got big attention from Western partners, whereas Belarus is getting only concerned statements on the situation in the country. So I would say that Ukraine's emancipation from Russia and the choice of amelioration of the partnership with EU and US was one of the reasons. In case of Belarus, Lukashenko was going back and forth between EU and Russia, and as we can see, took Russian side in the end. Obviously, one authoritarian regime will support another authoritarian pseudo-democracy. It was the same with Yanukovych in Ukraine. However, it's people who played the crucial role taking under control this movement, this back and forth movement, and clearly showing their preference to EU over Russia. So Belarusian protests do not aim to change between Russia and EU, but at least to deal with the past and the future, where Lukashenko is no longer taking over that future. I think I'm going to stop in here because if I'm going to continue with my parts, we're going to take some 10 more minutes. And I'm pretty sure everybody wants to be getting involved more in the debate. So thank you for listening, and I hope it was interesting to look up how Belarus is different from Ukraine and what to expect. Thank you.
We thank Ms. Nina Basok for her really fascinating presentation. And now we'd like to move on to the comments to our experts. And I'd like to give the floor to Daniel to carry on with that part.
Thank you very much. I'd like also to thank our participants for their speeches. Let's see in the comments. And we have a question to Ms. Kharchuk. What is Russia's stance on Chinese attempts to increase economic cooperation with Belarus?
Okay, so what is Russia's stance? I think when we talk about Russia and when we discuss the Russia's foreign policy, it's really hard to do that in the light of neo-Marxism. So I wouldn't do that in light of neo-Marxism because this theory just doesn't fit to this issue. And I think when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, because that was like the cornerstone of my presentation. So when it comes to this Belt and Road Initiative, this is something that makes China more influential. That is something that makes China more influential, especially in Eurasia, in the former Soviet countries. So I think that, for example, realism, maybe offensive realism, is a better theory when it comes to this question. I'm generally more focused on China when it comes to my research. So it is, so I'm generally more focused on China, and the question about Russia is kind of a surprise, but I have some thoughts about it, especially through the looking glass of the realist international relations theory. So the Belt and Road Initiative is something that will make China more influential. And in the eyes of Russia, this is definitely not something that Russia does want to happen. So this Belt and Road Initiative, Russia doesn't totally accept it. Officially it does, but in reality, not totally. So the problem is with the Belt and Road, and Belarus is a part of Belt and Road. So Vladimir Putin might not be very happy about this relationship, especially about the Belt and Road Initiative. And also Russia generally desires, what Russia desires is the further political integration between Russia and Belarus. And now Belarus has this substitute, like China. So Belarus is able to develop its relationship with China. And I don't think that this is good for Russia, like the very fact that Belarus has this substitute, someone else to have the strategic partnership with. And Beijing doesn't want Belarus to trade their autonomy, their sovereignty for the economic incentives. So Belarusian government, Belarusian companies might be granted these credits by the Chinese government. So they get these credits and they don't have to give their autonomy, to give up their autonomy. And what Russia wants, so when Russia offers Belarus some economic incentives. They want their autonomy in return. So it is kind of problematic for Russia, even though there is this kind of alliance between Russia and China. In the eyes of Moscow, it is not good that China and Belarus cooperate. That was kind of an expanded version of explanation.
Okay, thank you for answering this question. Meanwhile, I have one question from myself to Mr. Andrew Carroll. There are some voices that the change of regime, getting rid of Lukashenko, will push Russia further to annex even Belarus. When this is rather one of the less probable scenarios, hypothetically, how would NATO stance may change if Russia really tried to force their way into Belarus?
Well, if Russia forced its way into Belarus, I mean, that would be a major change in the strategic posture along the eastern flank of NATO, mostly because the current battle group deployments in Poland and the Baltic states would just not be really enough, I would say. And I think especially the Polish government as well as the Baltic governments would be very concerned at that point and be calling for increased reinforcement and the deployment of, I would imagine, increased American heavy armor as well as allied armored units back into those countries. I could see an expansion of military facilities, which are already being constructed, including a permanent American base in Poland. And this could possibly include the calls for the deployment of ground-launched intermediate-range weapons that were previously banned under the INF Treaty. Right now, there's not a lot of appetite in, I would say, most European countries, even those like Poland, which have been very open to the deployment of increased military resources. If there was a Russian, annexation somewhat analogous to Crimea or something similar to possibly what we currently see in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, that could change, and calls for that could change. So yes, I think it would seriously deteriorate the strategic situation, worse than it already is now. And if Russia did do that, even if they did so under the so-called Union State concept, I think it's pretty obvious that the Belarusian security institutions, the Defense Ministry, the KGB, and the Interior Ministry would essentially be subsumed by their larger and more influential Russian counterparts.
Okay, thank you. Already showed up 2 more questions for you, so let me start maybe. Question for our participant, Ms. Basok. She asked, or would you rather ask a question in person? Okay, so I'll ask is for you. Can we make a hypothesis that if opposition and elected President Tikhanovskaya take over Belarus, they would have a closer cooperation with NATO, despite Russia's influence? What do you think about it?
If Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is able to successfully, assume the presidency, as she did win the election, I think is relatively decided at this point. I think there very much could be a closer relationship. I think one thing that the actions of Lukashenko's government so far, of just running closer to Vladimir Putin in Moscow, has been to really, I think, drive public opinion more towards being open to having a close relationship with NATO. Obviously, there was openness in Belarus to having a close relationship with the EU. But I think NATO was obviously people were more hesitant about NATO. That could be changing. Obviously, there's no interest in Belarus becoming a member of NATO, and I don't think NATO should be pushing to say Belarus needs to become a member. That's the wrong strategy, but there should be one to show that, NATO is not looking to, invade and annex Belarus, kind of the opposite of the threat from the other side of the border. That NATO is, open to having Belarus and would prefer Belarus to be a neutral mediator to help maintain strategic stability between Russia and NATO in Eastern Europe. That I think is the more optimum role. And I think if NATO leadership is able to frame it that way, if Tikhanovskaya is able to assume the presidency and then hold new elections, I think that would go a long way in improving relations.
Okay, thank you. And I think that answers also a question for our viewer, because he asks, are there any chances of improving relations between Belarus and NATO in the short or medium term? But if you want to address this more further, then go ahead.
I would just, reiterate again, I think just NATO has to make clear that we're not trying to make Belarus a member, that, we want to have a close relationship. There should be a dialogue, and that can start, I think, with the military, at the military level, ensuring that there is an effort to make sure the military is not used against the people of Belarus. And then from there, that could be used as a broader way, possibly through the OSCE, to have Belarus act more as a neutral mediator between NATO and Russia.
Okay, thank you. And now we have a question to Ms. Basok. In view of the protests, could a pro-EU sentiment emerge, possibly after the overthrow of Lukashenko?
Well, basically, as we can see now, if we're merging Lukashenko from Belarus and we are having Tikhanovskaya taking over the power, let's call it that way, that is obvious that there are going to be some EU aspirations, I would say that way, in Belarus. As we can see, Tikhanovskaya went up to European leaders and she's trying to build a strategic cooperation with the European countries, not exactly with the European Union, but exactly with the European countries, separately with them. So she is making some arrangements on the financial aid for Belarus and so on. So this cooperation with the countries, member states of the European Union, and not only, would merge at least the authorities of Belarus, the future Belarus, to cooperate more with the European Union. Well, maybe there would be another way of reinsuring new directions in the Eastern Partnership, as now we know that European Union tries to make some tailor-made scenarios for each country in the Eastern Partnership. So if we look up for the opposition and for the future leaders of Belarus, then obviously they're going to be the pro-European aspirations, and there are pro-European movements, even though they were not the reason for the protest now. Also knowing that part of the protesters, well, they're not clearly indicating if they're looking for the reconnecting with the European Union or not, or they are supporting European Union or not, but looking up for protesters, their age, what they are asking for the democratic country, for the rule of law, taking the leading position in the country. I would say that it would be also a case with the population, even though clearly we don't see that perspective now among the population. On the level of the government and the elected Tikhanovskaya and the opposition itself, it is clearly that they would prefer going more European way than staying in the same back and forth relations as it was with Lukashenko, not giving a lot, but not giving less also. Well, Tsikhanouskaya stated also, I was just going back on one little point about Russia. Tsikhanouskaya stated a couple of times that they are looking out for improving their relations with the European Union in the future. However, she also said that she'd like to stay also on the good conditions with all of the neighbors that Belarus has. So obviously a big part of the neighborhood is connected to Russia. So I would say that she wasn't really taking sides on the European Union or Russia, but clearly she wants to stay on the neutral position, not giving any chances to use that against her in any way.
Okay, thank you very much for answering the question. I don't see any more of them, so let me proceed to the conclusions. Or if someone wants to address something said. If not, then let me proceed to the ending. We saw 3 speeches, couple questions. Each one of the speeches brilliant in their own way. It was a real pleasure hosting such guests at our conference. It was very insightful and fantastic panel. So I'd like to thank our speakers again for participating in our conference, and I also thank our viewers who are watching us throughout the day. This is the end of our